You know what made me completely rethink how I store food? Standing in my grandmother's root cellar in the middle of August and realizing every single jar on those shelves was still perfectly good from the previous fall. No freezer, no vacuum sealer, no electricity at all down there, just cool air, stone walls, and a system she learned from her own mother back when keeping food through winter wasn't a hobby. It was the difference between eating and going hungry. I remember pulling a jar of green beans off the shelf that day, beans she had put up the previous September, and when I opened the lid, they smelled like they had just come out of the garden. Meanwhile, I had a refrigerator full of produce at home that was already going soft after a week. That was the moment something shifted for me. I started paying attention to everything she did. And what I learned over the next few years completely changed how I think about food preservation and storage in my own home. Today, I'm going to walk you through the exact methods my grandmother and many families in her generation used to keep fruits, vegetables, dairy, and even meat fresh for months without any refrigeration at all. Plus, stick around because near the end, I'll share a simple cold storage setup you can build in a weekend using materials you probably already have. I'll be honest with you, for most of my adult life, I treated the refrigerator like the only option. If it came out of the garden or came home from the store, it went into the fridge. And if the fridge was full, things got shoved to the back and forgotten. I threw away more food than I care to admit. Wilted greens, soft carrots, forgotten leftovers, all of it ending up in the trash because I never questioned whether the refrigerator was actually the best place for everything I was putting in it. And it turns out, for a lot of foods, it isn't. My grandmother knew that. Her mother knew that. Entire communities knew that for centuries before electric refrigeration became standard in American homes in the 1930s and 1940s. We didn't lose these methods because they stopped working. We lost them because we stopped needing them. But here's the thing, they still work, every single one of them. And when you understand the principles behind them, you realize that cold electric storage is just one tool in a much larger system that our grandparents had already perfected. What I'm about to share with you isn't about rejecting modern convenience. It's about recovering knowledge that most of us were simply never taught. Here's the foundation that everything else builds on. Food spoils for three basic reasons: bacteria, moisture, and exposure to air. Every preservation method your grandmother used targets at least one of those three factors, and the best methods address all three simultaneously. Once you understand that, the logic behind every technique I'm about to show you makes perfect sense. You stop seeing these as old-fashioned workarounds and start seeing them as precise, effective solutions to a biological problem that hasn't changed in thousands of years. Let me start with the method my grandmother relied on more than any other: water bath canning. This was the backbone of her entire food storage system. Every summer and early fall, she would put up between 200 and 300 jars of fruits, vegetables, jams, pickles, relishes, and sauces. Those jars lined the shelves of her root cellar and her pantry, and they kept the family fed from October through April. Here's exactly how she did it. You start with clean mason jars, lids, and rings. The jars and rings are reusable year after year, but the flat lids with the rubber seal need to be new each time. That seal is what creates the airtight vacuum that keeps bacteria out. You prepare your food according to whatever recipe you're working with. For something like whole peeled tomatoes, you blanch them in boiling water for about 60 seconds, slip the skins off, pack them tightly into your jars, add a tablespoon of lemon juice per quart for acidity, and fill the remaining space with hot water or tomato juice, leaving about a ½ inch of headspace at the top. Wipe the rim of the jar clean, place the lid on, and screw the ring on fingertip tight. Not cranked down hard, just snug. Then the jars go into a large pot of boiling water, fully submerged with at least an inch of water covering the tops. For quart jars of tomatoes, you process them for 45 minutes at a rolling boil. When the time is up, you lift them out and set them on a towel on the counter. Within a few minutes to a few hours, you'll hear that distinctive pop as each lid seals down. That sound meant everything in my grandmother's kitchen. Each pop was another jar of food secured for winter. Now here's the science behind why this works. The boiling temperature kills the bacteria inside the jar. The heat causes the contents to expand, which forces air out through the lid. As the jar cools, the contents contract, creating a vacuum that pulls the lid down tight against the rim. No air can get back in. No new bacteria can reach the food. That jar will sit on a shelf at room temperature for a year or more, and the contents will be just as safe as the day they were sealed. My grandmother had jars that she opened 2 years after canning, and the food was still perfectly fine. The key is acidity. Water bath canning is safe for high-acid foods. Fruits, tomatoes with added lemon juice, pickles, jams, relishes, and anything preserved in vinegar. The acid environment prevents the growth of Clostridium botulinum, which is the one organism you genuinely need to respect in home canning. For low-acid foods like plain vegetables, meats, and soups, you need a pressure canner, which reaches higher temperatures than boiling water alone. My grandmother used a pressure canner for her green beans, corn, and chicken stock. The principle is the same, but the higher temperature is necessary to ensure safety with low-acid foods. I know pressure canning sounds intimidating. It did to me for years. But once you do it 3 or 4 times, it becomes routine. And the result is shelf-stable jars of soup, stock, beans, and vegetables that require 0 electricity to store. The second method my grandmother used extensively was salt curing and brining. This is one of the oldest preservation techniques in human history, and she used it for everything from cucumbers to pork. Salt preserves food by drawing moisture out of the cells through osmosis. Bacteria need moisture to survive and multiply. When you remove enough of that moisture, or when you create a salt concentration high enough that bacteria can't function in it, the food stays preserved indefinitely. Here's how she made her salt-brined pickles, the ones I've never been able to fully replicate no matter how many times I try. She packed fresh cucumbers into a large stoneware crock, layered with fresh dill, garlic cloves, mustard seed, and grape leaves. The grape leaves are the detail most people miss. They contain tannins that keep the pickles crisp instead of turning soft during fermentation. Then she mixed a brine of roughly 3 tablespoons of non-iodized salt per quart of water, poured it over the cucumbers until they were fully submerged, and weighted everything down with a plate and a clean stone to keep the cucumbers below the surface. That crock sat in a cool corner of the kitchen for about 3 to 4 weeks. During that time, naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria on the surface of the cucumbers converted sugars into lactic acid. The salt concentration prevented harmful bacteria from growing while allowing the beneficial lactobacillus to thrive. The result was a naturally fermented pickle with a complex sour flavor that no vinegar-based quick pickle can match. And those pickles, transferred into jars and kept in the root cellar, lasted all winter. She used the same salt principle for preserving pork. In late fall, when the weather turned cold and the family butchered a hog, she would rub cuts of pork with a heavy coating of salt mixed with a small amount of sugar and black pepper. The meat went into a wooden box or stoneware crock, layered with more salt, and was left in a cold space for several weeks. The salt drew out moisture and penetrated deeply into the meat, creating an environment where spoilage bacteria simply could not survive. After the curing period, she would hang some of the cuts in a smokehouse where low, slow smoke from hickory or apple wood added another layer of preservation and flavor. Smoked and salt-cured pork hung in a cool, dry space would keep for months. This is how country ham has been made for generations, and it's a method that predates refrigeration by centuries. The third method, and the one I think most people underestimate, is root cellaring. My grandmother's root cellar was dug into a hillside behind the house. The walls were stone, the floor was packed earth, and the temperature inside stayed between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, without any mechanical cooling. The natural insulation of the earth kept it cool in summer and prevented freezing in winter. She stored potatoes, carrots, beets, turnips, onions, apples, and winter squash in that cellar, and most of it lasted well into March or April. Here's the technique that made the difference. Not everything was stored the same way. Root vegetables like carrots, beets, and turnips were layered in wooden boxes between damp sand. The sand maintained humidity around the vegetables, preventing them from drying out and shriveling while still allowing enough air circulation to prevent rot. She never washed these vegetables before storage. The thin layer of soil left on the skins actually helped protect them. Potatoes were stored in burlap sacks or wooden crates in the darkest corner of the cellar. Light causes potatoes to produce solanine, which turns them green and makes them bitter. Darkness was essential. She also kept the potatoes away from the apples because apples release ethylene gas as they ripen, and that gas causes potatoes to sprout prematurely. Onions and garlic were braided together by their dried stems and hung from the ceiling where air could circulate freely around them. Properly cured onions stored this way lasted 4 to 5 months easily. Winter squash, like butternut and Hubbard, were cured in the sun for about 10 days after harvest to harden their skins, then placed on wooden shelves in the cellar where they would keep for 3 to 6 months depending on the variety. The whole system worked because she understood that different foods need different conditions. Some need humidity, some need dry air, some need darkness, some need circulation. And by organizing her root cellar according to those needs, she could keep a remarkable variety of produce fresh through an entire winter. If you're finding value in learning how previous generations approached food storage, take a second to subscribe. I've been exploring these traditional methods, and there's a lot more to share. Now let me show you the fourth method in this system: drying and dehydration. My grandmother dried herbs, fruits, beans, peppers, and even some meats, and the dried goods stored in cloth sacks or glass jars lasted a year or longer. The principle is the same one behind salt curing. Remove the moisture and you remove what bacteria need to grow. For herbs, she simply tied small bundles with kitchen string and hung them upside down in a warm, dry room with good airflow. Within a week or two, the herbs were completely dry and she would strip the leaves off the stems and store them in small jars. Rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, and dill all kept their flavor beautifully when dried this way. For fruits like apples and pears, she would peel and slice them thin, roughly 1/8 of an inch, and spread the slices on wooden drying racks set up in a sunny room or sometimes out on the porch on hot, dry days. Depending on the humidity and temperature, fruit would take anywhere from 2 to 4 days to dry fully. She tested doneness by tearing a slice in half. If no moisture beaded along the tear and the texture was leathery but pliable, it was done. Those dried apple slices rehydrated beautifully in pies and cobblers all through the winter months. For green beans, she used a technique called leather breeches. Fresh beans were strung on a length of heavy thread using a needle, piercing right through the center of each bean, and the whole string was hung from a rafter or a nail in a warm room. The beans dried over about 2 weeks until they were hard and brittle. Stored in a cloth sack in a cool, dry place, they kept for well over a year. To cook them, you'd soak them overnight in water and then simmer them low and slow with a ham hock for a couple of hours. The flavor of leather breeches beans is deeper and more concentrated than anything you get from a can or a freezer. It's one of those things that tastes like history. Now, here's something I want to share for anyone who doesn't have a root cellar and thinks these methods are out of reach. You can create a surprisingly effective cold storage space with very little effort and almost no cost. My grandmother would have called this common sense, but for most of us, it's a genuine revelation. If you have an unheated garage, a basement, or even an insulated crawl space, you already have the bones of a root cellar. The key is finding a space that stays between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter months and has some natural humidity. A simple min-max thermometer hung in the space for a week will tell you if it qualifies. If your garage gets too cold and freezes, you can insulate a small section of it by building a simple frame from 2x4s and lining it with rigid foam insulation. An insulated closet about 4 feet by 4 feet by 6 feet tall is enough to store a winter's worth of root vegetables, squash, and canned goods for a small family. Add a couple of wooden shelves. Keep a pan of water on the floor to maintain humidity for root vegetables, and make sure there's a small vent for air circulation. The whole project costs less than $50 in materials and takes a weekend to build. It's not a stone root cellar dug into a hillside, but it works on the same principles, and the results are genuinely impressive. Now, I want to be straight with you about something. These methods require planning and effort up front. Canning 200 jars in August and September is real work. Building drying racks and setting up a cold storage space takes time. But here's what my grandmother understood that I think our generation has largely forgotten. The work you do in late summer and early fall pays off every single day from November through March. Every jar you open, every basket of potatoes you pull from the cellar, Every bag of dried herbs you reach for is food you preserved with your own hands. Food that didn't require a monthly electricity bill to keep safe. Food that would still be there even if the power went out for a week. There is a security in that kind of self-reliance that is hard to describe until you experience it. I started small, just a few dozen jars of tomatoes and some dried herbs the first year. The following year, I added pickles and applesauce. By the third year, I was pressure canning stock and putting up enough food to genuinely reduce my grocery bill through the winter months. Each year, the process got easier and the results got better because I was building on what I learned the season before. And that's exactly what my grandmother told me would happen. Let me share some patterns I see in how most of us handle food storage today and how my grandmother's approach addresses things differently. The first pattern is relying entirely on the refrigerator for produce. Most of us put everything in the fridge the moment we bring it home, but a lot of produce actually does better outside of refrigeration. Tomatoes lose flavor in cold temperatures. Potatoes sprout faster under refrigerator light cycles. Onions get soft in high humidity. My grandmother stored each of these according to what the food actually needed, not according to the single temperature a refrigerator provides. The second pattern is buying food preservation equipment before learning the fundamentals. You don't need a freeze dryer or a commercial dehydrator to start preserving food. A large pot, some mason jars, and a bag of salt will get you started with canning and fermentation. My grandmother did all of this with equipment that cost almost nothing, and the food kept just as well as anything you'd produce with expensive modern gadgets. The third pattern is assuming preserved food is inferior to fresh. This is something I believed for years until I tasted my grandmother's pressure-canned chicken stock side by side with a carton from the store. Properly preserved food retains its nutrition, flavor, and texture remarkably well. In some cases, like fermented pickles and sauerkraut, the preservation process actually adds nutritional value through the creation of beneficial probiotics. The fourth pattern is treating food preservation as a single event rather than a system. My grandmother didn't just can tomatoes. She had a canning schedule that started with strawberry jam in June and ran through apple butter in October. She had a drying calendar, a curing timeline for meats, and a harvest sequence for root cellar storage. Every method supported the others, and the whole system was designed around the growing season in her region. That integration is what made it work so well. It wasn't one technique. It was a complete approach to feeding a family through the year. Now here's something I picked up from my grandmother that most books on food preservation don't cover, and it's perfect if you want a simple starting point that requires almost no equipment. Vinegar preservation. This is different from water bath canning because you're relying on the acidity of vinegar itself rather than a heat-sealed vacuum to prevent spoilage. My grandmother kept crocks and jars of vinegar-preserved vegetables on her counter and in her pantry throughout the year. The simplest version is this. Take fresh vegetables, peppers, onions, garlic, cauliflower, green beans, whatever you have, and pack them into a clean glass jar. Heat equal parts white vinegar and water with about a tablespoon of salt per cup of liquid until the salt dissolves. Pour the hot brine over the vegetables, making sure everything is fully submerged. and let it cool to room temperature before putting the lid on. These quick pickled vegetables stored in the refrigerator will last 2 to 3 months easily. But my grandmother went further. She used a higher ratio of vinegar to water, usually about 3 parts vinegar to 1 part water, and stored the jars in her root cellar where the cool temperature and high acidity kept the vegetables safe for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. The vinegar creates an environment so acidic that harmful bacteria simply cannot grow. This is how pickled peppers, pickled eggs, and pickled beets were kept on farmhouse shelves for generations. And the beauty of it is that you can start today. 1 jar, 1 bottle of vinegar, and whatever vegetables you have on hand. No special equipment, no special skills. Just an understanding of why acid stops bacteria and the willingness to try. That's what I've learned from my grandmother and from families who grew up preserving food as a way of life rather than a weekend project. They weren't using any technology we don't have access to. They were just paying attention to how food actually behaves and building simple systems around that knowledge. The refrigerator is a wonderful invention, but it's not the only way to keep food safe. And for many foods, it's not even the best way. If any of this changed how you think about storing food in your own home, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you've been preserving food using methods you learned from your own family, tell me what's working for you. Hit subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into how previous generations solved everyday problems. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.